Agatha Raisin and the Fatal Meeting at Plover Hall. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to the Detective Notebook. The meeting in Carsley was meant to be harmless. Tea, polite smiles, and quiet judgments. But inside Plover Hall, a single decision turned fatal. By the time silence fell, one life was over. Agatha Raisin noticed everything. She just didn't yet know what it meant. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 1. Routine, Resentment, and an Unwanted Invitation. Agatha Raisin began her morning with the firm belief that if one did not assert dominance over the day immediately, the day would take liberties. Unfortunately, the day had already begun by being cold, gray, and smugly quiet outside her Carsley cottage. She stood in her kitchen, wrapped in a cardigan she pretended was cozy rather than forgiving, pouring herself a mug of coffee so strong it gave off a faintly medicinal smell. The steam curled upward like a warning. She took a sip, winced, then nodded in approval. "Good," she muttered. "If it doesn't hurt, it's pointless." On the counter, Hodge and Boswell sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at her with the sort of judgment normally reserved for social faux pas and poor life choices. Their empty bowls were positioned with deliberate neatness, as if to underline her failure as a provider. "I know," Agatha said sharply, reaching for the bread. "You're starving. You've been neglected. Call the authorities." She dropped the toast into the toaster and leaned against the counter, catching her reflection in the kettle. Her hair was slightly wild, her face faintly creased, and her expression unimpressed with what she saw. "Honestly," she told herself, peering closer, "some people wake up glowing. I wake up aware." The toast popped. She butted it aggressively, creating a thick yellow layer she insisted was moderation. One bite later, she chewed thoughtfully. "Perfectly edible," she announced to the cats. "Ignore anyone who says otherwise." Boswell flicked his tail. Hodge stared pointedly at the cupboard where the better cat food lived. Agatha sighed, surrendered, and filled their bowls. They ate as though she'd narrowly avoided permanent disgrace. The quiet was broken by the soft thump of paper through the letterbox. Agatha frowned. Post before 8 was rarely good news. She retrieved the item. The village newsletter, printed on cheery pastel paper that suggested enthusiasm where none was warranted. She skimmed past bake sales, choir rehearsals, and something about hedge trimming, then stopped. Mandatory community meeting, Plover Hall, today, 10 a.m. Chair, Penelope Firth Jones. Agatha's jaw tightened. "Oh, absolutely not," she said aloud. Penelope Firth Jones had a voice like honey poured over gravel and a smile that implied constant superiority. She chaired things. She enjoyed chairing things. Worse, she made it look effortless. Agatha read the notice again. "Mandatory," she snorted. "I'm not in school, and even then I question the rules." Her eyes scanned the rest of the announcement. Vague wording, important matters, attendance required. No explanation. Plover Hall. She felt a flicker of irritation sharpen into something more alert. Plover Hall was not used lightly. It was reserved for decisions, disputes, and moments when the village liked to pretend it was important. Agatha folded the newsletter, then unfolded it again. She fetched a red pen from the drawer and circled the words "attendance required" with unnecessary force. The cats watched. "Well," she demanded, "what do you think?" Boswell licked his paw. Hodge yawned. "Exactly," she said. "No one likes being ordered about." She glanced toward the window, where the morning mist clung to the hedgerows. Somewhere beyond them sat Plover Hall, solid and watchful. She didn't like the thought of Penelope presiding over anything there. Agatha finished her coffee, wiped her mouth, and straightened her shoulders. "Fine," she said briskly. "I'll go, if only to make sure she doesn't enjoy it." The cats resumed eating, utterly unconcerned. Agatha picked up the newsletter once more, that circled phrase glaring back at her. Mandatory. For reasons she couldn't quite name, it felt less like an invitation and more like a warning. Agatha Raisin took the long way into the village. partly out of habit and partly because she refused to rush toward anything chaired by Penelope Firth Jones. The morning mist still clung to Carsley like an indecisive guest, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows, making everything look gentler than it truly was. Plover Hall emerged gradually, its stone facade looming beyond the last bend in the lane. It had always struck Agatha as a building that knew things, old things, inconvenient things, and enjoyed keeping them to itself. Today it looked cleaner, fresher, almost smug. She slowed her pace. Fresh paint glinted faintly near the windows. New gravel crunched underfoot where weeds had once claimed victory. Someone had spent money here, and not quietly. "Well," Agatha muttered, "that's new and unnecessary." As if to underline the point, a sleek dark blue car was parked near the entrance, far too polished for village life. It looked imported, confident, the sort of car that belonged to someone who never worried about mud on their tires. Agatha sniffed. Overcompensating, she decided. The front door opened, and Penelope Firth Jones stepped out as if summoned by irritation alone. She wore a cream coat that sat perfectly on her shoulders, and a smile that suggested she'd practiced it in reflective surfaces. "Agatha," Penelope said brightly. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" Agatha eyed her. "If you enjoy damped cold and community pressure, yes, glorious." Penelope laughed, a light, controlled sound. "I trust you saw the newsletter." "I did. Hard to miss. Pastel coercion is very effective." Penelope tilted her head. "I do hope you'll attend. It's important we all pull together." Agatha noted the "we," which somehow excluded her entirely. She also noted Penelope's immaculate hair, her calm confidence, and the faint sting of envy she immediately resented. "I wouldn't dream of missing it," Agatha said coolly. "I'm very fond of being told what to do." Penelope's smile tightened just enough to be satisfying. "Excellent. Oh, and do be prompt. We're on a schedule." Agatha watched her glide back inside, resisting the urge to trip her with a well-placed foot. "Schedule," Agatha muttered. "In Carsley." She lingered a moment longer, pretending to examine the notice board while actually studying the building. Through one of the tall windows, movement flickered. Shapes, shadows, then voices. Low at first, then sharper. A man's voice, irritated. A woman's, clipped and controlled. Words blurred together, but the tone was unmistakable. An argument. Agatha leaned closer, heart giving a small, traitorous thump of interest. "Can't do this now." "You said it was settled." The voices cut off abruptly. Agatha straightened, finding herself staring directly at a window where a curtain shifted slightly, then stilled. I cleared my throat loudly. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "that was subtle." The door opened again, just a fraction this time, then closed with deliberate calm. Agatha stepped back, irritation blooming into something sharper. Why argue here? Why today? And why stop the moment she appeared? She turned away, walking briskly down the path, but her mind lagged behind, replaying the fragments she'd heard. Plover Hall had never been quiet about its secrets. It simply waited for the right moment. Behind her, there was a soft, decisive sound. Click. Agatha paused, glancing back just in time to see the door firmly shut, the new lock catching the light. Locked. She frowned, unsettled in a way she didn't care to examine too closely. "Well," she said briskly, squaring her shoulders, "this village is becoming far too dramatic." She walked on, irritation in her stride, curiosity in her thoughts, and the uncomfortable feeling that Plover Hall had been watching her just as closely as she'd been watching it. Chapter 2. A Meeting That Ends Early. By 10 o'clock precisely, Plover Hall was filled with the sound of polite voices pretending not to dislike one another. Agatha Raisin paused just inside the doorway, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime judging rooms before they judged her. Folding chairs had been arranged in careful rows, slightly too close together, ensuring no one could sit without brushing against a neighbor they secretly resented. A long table at the side bore teapots, mismatched cups, and a plate of biscuits that looked as though they had been baked during a previous administration. Agatha selected a seat near the aisle, close enough to observe, far enough to escape if necessary. Around her, villagers smiled thinly and murmured greetings. Agatha, Morning. Cold, isn't it? Unnecessarily. She accepted a cup of tea from someone she didn't like and took a cautious sip. It tasted faintly of disappointment. The biscuits were worse. Agatha picked one up, sniffed it, and bit delicately. The texture suggested commitment, but the flavor never quite arrived. Ambitious, she muttered, setting it aside. Across the room, Penelope Firth Jones stood near the front, clipboard in hand, radiating authority like a well-ironed blouse. She greeted arrivals with serene efficiency, her smile fixed firmly in place. Agatha noted who sat close to Penelope and who deliberately chose seats as far away as possible. Rivalries revealed themselves in inches. Mrs. Cartwright avoided Darcy Bell's gaze. Mr. Phelps pretended not to see anyone at all. Several people glanced repeatedly toward the door, then looked away when it failed to open. Agatha followed their gazes. One chair in the front row was empty, not casually empty either. It sat slightly apart, angled as though it had been reserved. Agatha frowned. She leaned toward her neighbor. "Who's missing?" The woman shrugged. "I thought you knew." Agatha straightened. She disliked unanswered questions almost as much as she disliked Penelope's tone. Penelope clapped her hands lightly. "Shall we begin?" The room settled, chairs scraping, coughs suppressed. Agatha noticed a man near the wall tapping his foot too quickly, a woman twisting her wedding ring until her finger reddened. Penelope launched into opening remarks about community harmony and shared responsibility. Agatha listened with half an ear, more interested in the undercurrents. People weren't listening. They were waiting. For what? She couldn't yet say. Her gaze drifted upward, toward the ceiling. The upper floor loomed unseen, quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Penelope cleared her throat. "Before we proceed, we're just waiting on one final attendee." A murmur rippled through the room. Agatha's curiosity sharpened. Final attendee implied importance. Minutes passed. Tea cooled. Someone dropped a biscuit which cracked loud enough to cause 3 people to flinch. Penelope's smile thinned. "I'll just—" She was interrupted by a sound that did not belong in polite village meetings. A heavy thud echoed from above, followed by a faint rattling noise. The room froze. Agatha felt her pulse jump, then steadied herself. She disliked surprises, especially noisy ones. "What was that?" someone whispered. Penelope stiffened. "Probably nothing. Old building." But Agatha saw the flicker of unease cross her face before the smile returned. Another pause. No laughter followed. No one resumed sipping tea. Agatha rose slightly in her chair, eyes fixed on the staircase leading upward. Whatever had made that sound, it hadn't been nothing, and whoever was meant to be sitting in that empty chair had not arrived for a reason. For a moment after the sound, no one moved. The silence that followed was not the comfortable sort Carsley excelled at, but something heavier, stretched tight and uneasy, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Penelope recovered first. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, too quickly. "Perhaps someone dropped a chair." Agatha doubted that. She had dropped chairs before. None of them had sounded like that. A man near the aisle, Mr. Green, she thought, though he looked increasingly unsure of his own identity, cleared his throat. "Shouldn't someone check?" Several people nodded at once, relieved someone else had said it. Penelope hesitated, then gestured sharply towards the stairs. "Very well, just to put minds at ease." Mr. Green and another man climbed the stairs together, their footsteps echoing far louder than necessary. The rest of the room waited, teacups abandoned, biscuits forgotten. Agatha leaned back, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the staircase. She noticed the way people avoided looking at one another now. Smiles had vanished entirely. Hands fidgeted. A woman near the window whispered something urgent to her husband. Time dragged. Then came a sound far worse than the first. A sharp inhale. A strangled shout. "Oh! Oh no!" Agatha was on her feet before she realized it. Chairs scraped. People surged forward, voices overlapping. "What is it? Is someone hurt? Don't go up there!" Penelope rushed towards the stairs, clipboard forgotten. Agatha followed, not pushing, but not hesitating either. Curiosity had long since overtaken irritation. The side room upstairs was small and poorly lit, its door standing ajar. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish, and beneath it something sharper, metallic and wrong. The body lay near a table, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath them.
A chair was overturned, its legs pointing accusingly towards the ceiling. A teacup lay shattered on the floor, the pale stain of tea creeping slowly towards the skirting board. Agatha took it all in with an uncomfortable clarity. Locked room, she thought automatically. Overturned chair, broken cup, no sign of a struggle beyond what lay before them. A sob sobbed behind her. Penelope pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Agatha's gaze moved upward. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. The door, she noticed, had no sign of damage. Locked. "Has anyone touched anything?" Penelope demanded. "No. We just opened the door." Agatha frowned. "It was locked?" He nodded. "From the outside." A ripple of shock ran through the group. Someone fetched water. Someone else muttered prayers. The meeting, forgotten entirely, dissolved into chaos. Agatha stepped back slightly, her mind already arranging details. She noticed what others missed. The faint scuff mark near the table leg, the way the body had fallen not forward but sideways. The cup had broken after it hit the floor, not before. "Call the police," someone said. Penelope nodded sharply. Yes, of course." A phone appeared. Voices lowered. Agatha leaned against the wall, her heart beating steadily, if a little faster than usual. She had not known the victim well, but she knew the voice. It hit her suddenly, unpleasantly. The argument. The raised voices she'd overheard earlier, muffled behind glass and curtains. One of them belonged to the person now lying motionless on the floor. Agatha closed her eyes briefly. So that was why the chair was empty. The police were on their way. No one was allowed to leave. Plover Hall, freshly renovated and freshly locked, held them all together in shared shock. Agatha opened her eyes, looking once more at the still figure. I knew that voice, she thought grimly, and she had a sinking feeling that this meeting had been fatal, long before it ever began.
Chapter 3. Suspects with Polite Smiles. By mid-morning, Carsley's police arrived, not in sirens or flashing lights, but in practical shoes and coats that suggested competence rather than drama. Sergeant Dalloway, a man who looked perpetually tired but efficient, took charge, clipboard at the ready, eyes flicking over the villagers gathered in Plover Hall's main room. "Right," he began, voice calm, authoritative. "We'll go around, ask a few questions. Anyone knows anything relevant, speak up. Anyone lying, well, we'll find out." Polite nods and murmurs followed. Agatha sat near the back, tea long forgotten, eyes scanning faces with the practiced scrutiny of someone who had observed human folly more times than she cared to admit. She noted nervous habits first. Mrs. Cartwright's hands were wringing the sleeves of her cardigan, a small tremor visible in her fingers. Mr. Phelps shifted constantly in his chair, avoiding the eye of anyone but the floor. Darcy Somerville, Agatha's perennial irritant, leaned back, smug but pale at the temples, fanning herself as though that would hide inner panic. "Funny how tension looks like calm when you don't want it noticed," Agatha muttered quietly to herself. Hodge and Boswell weren't here to witness, but she imagined their judgmental glares nonetheless. Sergeant Dalloway began with the front row, asking each attendee where they had been during the period surrounding the fatal incident. Responses were careful, polished, rehearsed. Agatha's inner commentary ran like a running track. One answer seemed rehearsed, another too casual. One woman, speaking in clipped tones, hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Oh, they're all lying, or at least exaggerating. Humanity hasn't changed much since the Romans." The humor in her mind eased the creeping tension in the room, though her eyes never left the suspects. Penelope Firth Jones, usually so composed and radiant, stood with one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other pressed against her chest as though to reassure herself. Her smile was tight, brittle. Agatha noted the subtle quiver at the corners of her mouth, defensive yet proud, a combination that meant secrets or guilt. Someone whispered gossip, soft enough to pass as idle chatter, about a recent disagreement over renovations at Plover Hall, and Agatha stifled a smile. Even in the shadow of death, village rivalries persisted. One man had argued loudly about seating arrangements, another had opposed spending money on cosmetic upgrades. Each seemed petty, each potentially dangerous in the right or wrong mood. As questioning continued, Agatha noticed a growing tension around one topic, a missing document. Papers had been shuffled, files searched, and murmurs suggested that the absent item could hold vital information about Plover Hall's management or the victim's last intentions. Ah, Agatha thought, frowning, now we're getting somewhere. Who had it last? Why had it disappeared at the precise moment someone ended up dead? And was its absence deliberate? The police moved to the next row. A couple of villagers exchanged quick glances, barely perceptible. Agatha's lips twitched. That glance said everything the words would not. By the time Sergeant Dalloway paused for a sip of tea, the hall was filled with a peculiar mixture: subdued fear, simmering rivalry, and muted curiosity. The empty chair from earlier still loomed, a silent reminder that someone was conspicuously absent or absent-mindedly guilty. Agatha leaned forward, elbows on her knees, notebook forming in her mind. There were stories behind every glance, every cough, every slight tremor in the hand. Everyone here had something to hide. Everyone, that is, except perhaps the cats she left at home, judging her as usual. Now, she whispered to herself, if only someone would fess up, or at least mislead me in a thoroughly entertaining way. And then it happened, a soft mention from a clerk of a document that had vanished, a detail small enough to be overlooked, yet too precise for coincidence. Agatha's heart skipped. This missing document, it could explain everything or nothing, but she knew one thing for certain: the real story was far from finished. Agatha stepped through the front door of her Carsley cottage, letting the warmth envelop her like an old, slightly scratchy blanket. The mist outside clung stubbornly to the hedgerows, but inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and the lingering aroma of yesterday's biscuits. She dropped her bag by the door, loosening her scarf with the precision of someone who had learned over decades that small victories mattered. Hodge and Boswell were waiting, perched on the counter, eyes glittering like twin judges. Boswell twitched a whisker in disapproval. Hodge's tail swished as though signaling, "We demand dinner, human, immediately." All right, Agatha said, filling their bowls. "You may have your vengeance in the form of premium cat food." She watched as they ate with the kind of dedication that made her question the purpose of human effort. Once the cats were satisfied, or at least distracted, Agatha poured herself a second mug of coffee, slightly weaker this time. She leaned against the counter, considering the morning. Plover Hall, the thud upstairs, the body, and the curious, glaring absence of one particular chair. She replayed the voices she had overheard outside the hall earlier: anger, irritation, clipped tones, familiarity. Someone's voice carried a subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible, that suggested more than a casual disagreement. Her brow furrowed. "It's nagging me because I know it," she murmured to herself. Agatha picked up her small hand mirror and examined her reflection, not because vanity demanded it, though of course vanity always demanded it, but because she needed something familiar in the chaos. Hair slightly mussed, cheeks flushed from the brisk walk and lingering tension, eyes alert and sharp. She straightened the collar of her cardigan and muttered, "At least I still look alive, not that it helps anyone." Hodge yawned. Boswell's ears twitched. Their judgment was merciless and soothing in equal measure. They had no need to hide motives, no need to worry about missing documents or empty chairs. Agatha returned to the events of the meeting. Penelope's clipped smiles, the murmuring villagers, the rising tension around the missing document. Something about it didn't sit right. It felt deliberate, the way secrets often did in Carsley. Why hide something so trivial if it weren't important? Her thoughts drifted back to the upstairs argument. The voices, muffled through glass and curtains, were now sharper in memory. One tone, half frustration, half warning, stood out. The victim had spoken in that exact way, didn't they? She recalled the rhythm, the pitch, the subtle tightening at the end of certain words. Yes, that was them. Agatha shivered faintly, sipping her coffee. "Of course, nothing is ever straightforward," she muttered. "And yet I feel I've noticed more than anyone else. I always do." She resisted the urge to smile. There were deaths to consider. The cats leapt down and padded toward the door, tails high. Hodge brushed against her leg, demanding attention, while Boswell meandered to the window-sill, silently surveying the garden. Agatha bent to scoop them, indulging in a brief moment of domestic normality.
The warmth of their fur against her hands was reassuring. Yet even as she enjoyed this calm, her mind ticked relentlessly. Something didn't fit about the sequence of events. If the meeting started at 10, if everyone had arrived when they did, how was it possible? A sudden realization tightened her chest. Someone had left Plover Hall after the thud, after the discovery, before the body was found. The timing made no sense. Agatha set her coffee down, ignoring the cat's protests. Her eyes narrowed, determination flaring beneath the veneer of exhaustion. She needed to know who it was. Hodge meowed plaintively. Boswell hissed softly in disapproval, but Agatha barely heard them. Someone had left, and that someone might know far more than anyone had admitted. The puzzle was shifting, and Agatha Raisin had already begun to move the pieces in her mind.
Chapter 4. Red Herrings and Raised Eyebrows. Agatha Raisin stepped carefully through the wrought-iron gates of Carsley's Village Garden Club, her boots crunching faintly on gravel. The spring air was sharp but sweet with early blooms, the scent of freshly turned earth mingling with faint hints of fertilizer and last week's rain. She straightened her coat, muttering to herself about appearances. One must always look competent, even if one felt like a walking disaster inside. Inside, a dozen women clustered around long tables, petals and soil under fingernails, comparing bulbs, pruning shears, and, most crucially, each other's social capital. Agatha's eyes scanned the room instantly, noting alliances, rivalries, and the subtle hierarchies that shifted with every comment. "Darcy, your daffodils are impressive," one woman said, with a tone that suggested they were actually frighteningly perfect. Darcy smiled smugly, brushing imaginary dust from her gloves. "I do try. One must maintain standards." Agatha's lips twitched. Standards, yes, but style over substance as usual. She leaned against a table, arms crossed, hiding a smirk. Hodge and Boswell were, of course, absent, but she imagined their critical stares. Darcy looks like a daffodil herself, Agatha thought, overly waxed, completely hollow inside. A discussion began over the village's upcoming flower show, each woman describing her plot, her planting technique, and, inevitably, her influence over others. Agatha noted who listened closely, who fidgeted, and who spoke with tiny flashes of envy. The room pulsed with polite tension and passive-aggressive compliments. Mrs. Cartwright, sitting nearby, whispered to Agatha as she trimmed a stubborn stem. "You know, I heard, well, I shouldn't repeat it, but the victim, they were planning to shake things up at Plover Hall." Agatha's eyes narrowed. "Shake things up?" she asked, voice low. The words were innocent on the surface, but she caught the way Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted, careful not to linger too long. "Something about reallocating funds," Mrs. Cartwright murmured. "It would have ruffled feathers. I suppose that's why some people weren't pleased." Agatha felt a flicker of excitement, carefully masked as casual interest. So, there had been motives buried in plain sight, hidden beneath civility and flower arrangements. Her mind raced. Who stood to lose? Who benefited from the status quo? She bent to examine a tulip, pretending disinterest. "And this comes from whom exactly?" she asked, lightly pressing a finger into the damp soil. Mrs. Cartwright hesitated. "Oh, someone close to the hall, very close, but you didn't hear it from me." Agatha tilted her head. Every clue mattered, no matter how small, even if presented as gossip. She scribbled mental notes, aware that in Carsley, secrets traveled faster than the daffodils bloomed. Darcy leaned across the table, nodding toward a particularly gaudy arrangement. "You'll want to consider how your display looks in context," she said, sweetly condescending. "Presentation matters as much as substance." Agatha fought the urge to roll her eyes. The woman's smugness was almost tactile. Almost. She moved toward the exit, inhaling the earthy perfume of soil, mulch, and spring flowers. The garden's quiet murmur contrasted sharply with the tension she carried from Plover Hall. She had seen envy and pride fester here, just as she had elsewhere. And then she heard it. A name, mentioned casually, almost carelessly, yet impossible to ignore. Agatha froze mid-step. Her heart skipped. That name, uttered in hushed tones, tucked into a remark about the hall, was one she had not expected to hear. It made her pulse quicken. Who had said it, and why now? Even among blooms, gossip, and gentle spring air, the shadows of Plover Hall's secrets crept in. Agatha stepped back from the bedlands, mind buzzing, senses alert. One thing was certain. Nothing here, not even the scent of earth or the polite chatter, could keep her from noticing what she had just heard, and she would not forget that name. Agatha Raisin pushed open the heavy door of the village pub, the warmth and faint aroma of roasting meat immediately wrapping around her like a comforting shawl. The chatter of locals, clinking glasses, and the occasional bark of laughter felt almost therapeutic after the tense hours at Plover Hall. She let out a slow breath, the lingering chill from the misty streets slipping away. She perched on a high stool near the bar, sliding a small notebook from her bag. Hodge and Boswell were at home, undoubtedly judging her choice to leave them behind, but Agatha preferred human gossip over feline scrutiny this time. The landlord, a cheerful man named Reggie, set a glass of Merlot in front of her. "Rough morning?" he asked, raising a brow. "You could say that," Agatha replied, swirling the wine and catching the faint scent of berries and oak. "Nothing like village intrigue to wake the senses," she smirked. From her perch, she observed the room. Several villagers nursed pints, whispering amongst themselves. Glances were exchanged with subtle tension, some friendly, some wary. One figure, Mrs. Bell, glanced repeatedly toward the entrance, frowning each time someone new arrived. Agatha leaned slightly closer to a man nursing a pale ale, careful to appear casual. "Did you hear anything unusual at Plover Hall?" she asked conversationally. The man blinked, hesitated, and muttered something about seeing people going upstairs, but nothing significant. His eyes flicked nervously toward the door. Agatha's pen hovered. She had noticed his slip, a hesitation, a detail unprompted. Timing. He had implied he wasn't upstairs when he clearly had been. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. The faintest flicker of amusement warmed her chest. Small lies reveal so much. Her thoughts drifted briefly to James Lacey. She could almost hear his teasing voice. "You notice everything, don't you, Agatha?" She smiled faintly, shaking the memory off with a sip of wine. Nostalgia mingled uneasily with tension. Returning her attention to the pub, she caught a fragment of conversation from another table. Two women whispered about renovations at Plover Hall, voices low but carrying an edge. One mentioned the missing document, the other waved it off, suggesting it wasn't worth the fuss. Agatha's pen scratched across her notebook as she processed the bits of information. A figure passed by, and Agatha's eyes caught something unexpected. Tiny dark stains on the fingers, like ink or perhaps a spill from one of the documents at Plover Hall. Her pulse quickened. She adjusted her position subtly, pretending to sip wine as she studied the hands as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The slip of truth, combined with the ink-stained fingers, suggested carelessness, or perhaps an attempt to cover tracks. Either way, it piqued Agatha's curiosity more sharply than the wine's warmth could. Around her, the pub hummed with cozy chatter. Someone laughed at a joke about the high street, another dropped a napkin, the sound oddly grounding. Yet beneath that comfort was a simmering tension, people avoiding certain topics, glancing furtively at one another, holding back just enough to keep Agatha's mind whirring. She scribbled mental notes, organizing timelines and motives, each observation feeding her sense of purpose. She realized that even in the warmth of the pub, truth hid in details too small for anyone else to notice. Agatha leaned back, swirling her wine, mind alert. There was humor, warmth, and normality here, but also unease. One partial truth, one slip could unravel much more than anyone suspected. Her gaze shifted subtly again to the ink-stained fingers. Whoever they belonged to had touched something important, and Agatha knew instinctively it wasn't accidental. A shiver of anticipation ran down her spine, and in that moment she understood that Plover Hall's secrets were far from settled, and that she was only beginning to untangle them. Chapter 5. false leads, and familiar pain. Agatha Raisin pushed open the heavy doors of the village records office, a smell of old paper, ink, and dust greeting her like a slightly disagreeable relative. The office was quiet, save for the low hum of the heating and the occasional rustle of filing cabinets. She paused to appreciate the comforting absurdity of bureaucracy, a place where human ambition collided with alphabetical order and endless forms. "Morning, Agatha," muttered Mrs. Fletcher, the clerk, peering over her glasses. "Looking for anything tragic today?" Agatha smirked. "Tragedy always finds me, but yes, I'd like to start with Plover Hall's recent minutes and attendance logs." Mrs. Fletcher raised an eyebrow, already wary of Agatha's penchant for digging where she shouldn't. "Suit yourself, but don't blame me if you find someone's sins in triplicate." Agatha settled at a long wooden table, spreading out folders and loose sheets. She began tracing signatures, dates, and notes, muttering to herself. So many perfectly mundane details, yet one of them always carries a lie. Hours passed in slow, meticulous comparison. She noted minor inconsistencies, an extra margin line here, a faintly uneven date there. Humor crept in as she imagined the committee members arguing over which shade of ink matched officialness. One could make a career of dull mischief in a place like this, she thought. Then she noticed it, a signature that didn't quite match the others. The flourish at the end was wrong, a subtle hesitation in the loops that spoke of either carelessness or intent. "Forged," she whispered, leaning closer. The missing document had clearly been tampered with. Someone had gone to the trouble of fabricating authenticity. Agatha traced the pen strokes carefully. The ink was dry but familiar, a sharp black that suggested a fountain pen rather than a biro. A faint smudge at the top suggested hasty correction. Her mind ticked through village personalities. Who could possess both skill and opportunity? And then, of course, her thoughts returned, unwillingly, to Penelope Firth Jones. The woman's polished authority, the way she orchestrated meetings, and her undeniable influence over village decisions suddenly felt more pointed. Jealousy crept in, simmering alongside suspicion. Agatha hated being envious of anyone, but it was hard not to acknowledge the subtle power Penelope wielded over everyone else, and especially over events at Plover Hall. She tapped the papers lightly, as if to summon clarity. The forger had intended secrecy, and yet errors always emerged. Always. The records yielded more details, timestamps that conflicted with recollections, small annotations in pencil that didn't match the official hand. Agatha scribbled notes, her mind already weaving together possibilities. Someone had crafted an illusion of normality, relying on the assumption that no one would check twice. She paused, staring at the signature. Recognition struck slowly, like a distant bell tolling, a quiet, infuriating familiarity. She had seen it before, not in a meeting or in gossip, but somewhere she had looked closely, somewhere she had allowed her attention to sharpen beyond polite observation. Her pulse quickened. The ink, the loops, the hasty correction. She knew this hand. Agatha leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. Humor, absurdity, and paperwork could only distract so much. This was no longer a curiosity, it was a confirmation. She folded the papers carefully, aware of the weight of what she had discovered. Someone had forged the missing document, and now she knew whose hand had done it. One thought reverberated through her mind, equal parts shock and reluctant admiration. This signature, it matches someone I never would have suspected. And with that realization, the comfortable hum of the records office seemed suddenly too small, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Agatha Raisin closed the front door of her Carsley cottage with a definitive thunk, as if that alone could lock away the swirling chaos of Plover Hall. Inside, the familiar warmth, the smell of coffee and old books, and the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. Hodge and Boswell were already perched on the counter, tails flicking in judgment, their eyes gleaming with the silent critique only cats could manage. "All right, you two," Agatha said, setting down her bag and pouring a second cup of coffee. "Let's talk." She addressed the cats as if they were an expert panel. The missing document? Forged. Signature? Recognizable. Sequence of events? Odd. Someone left Plover Hall after the thud, but before the body was discovered. Someone, she waved her hand dramatically, causing Boswell to raise a single unimpressed eyebrow, lost control. Hodge mewed impatiently. Boswell flicked a tail. Clearly, they were not impressed with the depth of her insight or the complexity of human folly. Agatha crouched to scratch behind Hodge's ears, finding a strange comfort in the softness of his fur against her fingertips. I know. You do it differently. Cats are always better at handling confrontations. No messy documents, no awkward alibis, no absurd village politics. She leaned back against the counter, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, letting the warmth seep into her bones. But think about it. The murder wasn't planned, not fully. It was the confrontation that triggered it. Someone came in expecting control and didn't get it. That changes everything. Agatha's mind raced. Timing mattered. Presence mattered. The empty chair, the voices upstairs, the thud. They were no longer separate oddities. They were the dominoes of an escalation that went horribly wrong. She glanced at Boswell, whose green eyes glimmered with judgment. I know you don't care about paperwork or motives, but I do, and I notice things. That's why I can... A thought struck her sharply. The forged signature, the misplaced alibis, the subtle slips of the pub conversation, all converged around the idea that someone tried to manipulate events but failed spectacularly. The victim had confronted or been confronted, and chaos ensued. Hodge mewed again, insistently, reminding her that cats, unlike humans, acted decisively. Agatha smiled faintly. If only I could be that decisive. She moved to the window, staring out at the misted garden where early daffodils had begun to bloom. The calm outside was deceiving. Villagers strolled past in neat coats, oblivious to the chaos now embedded in their community. Agatha's coffee cooled, forgotten. Her gaze returned to her notes sprawled across the kitchen table. She traced timelines with a finger, aligning the actions she had observed, the words she had overheard, and the tiny details others would overlook. The teacup's position, the ink stains, the trembling hands, the empty chair. Her stomach tightened. She was on the cusp of understanding the sequence, of pinpointing who had reacted violently in a moment of frustration, but there was still a missing piece, the spark that ignited the chaos. She leaned back, letting her eyes sweep over the comforting clutter of her kitchen, cats, mugs, papers, and notebooks. Even here, in her sanctuary, the puzzle pressed in. A faint sound made her stiffen. Footsteps? No. Closer. Deliberate. Another knock. Soft, measured, but impossible to ignore. Agatha's heart gave a quick, involuntary flutter. She set down her coffee carefully, noting the rising tension in her chest. Someone at the door now meant choices had to be made. Answers could arrive, or danger could walk in. She straightened, smoothing her hair, taking a deep breath. Hodge? Boswell? This could be interesting, or very, very unpleasant. Another knock sounded, louder this time, punctuating the quiet of her cottage with urgency. Agatha's mind raced, curiosity mingling with unease. And in that instant, she realized whatever or whoever stood on the doorstep might bring the next crucial clue or complicate everything she thought she knew. Chapter 6. The Net Tightens. The door to Agatha Raisin's cottage creaked open to reveal an unexpected visitor. Not quite the danger she had feared, but certainly someone determined to inject themselves into her investigation. Agatha's first instinct was to reach for Hodge and Boswell, who immediately sprang from the counter, tails high and claws unsheathed in warning. "Agatha Raisin?" the visitor began, voice wavering as though rehearsed, yet carrying the heavy weight of guilt. She eyed the figure carefully. This was someone who understood the stakes, but lacked the courage, or perhaps the clarity, to tell the full truth. "Yes," Agatha replied evenly, perched on the edge of her chair like a cat ready to pounce on a particularly slow mouse. "And you are?" The visitor swallowed, shifting uneasily. I suppose I should tell you what happened at Plover Hall." Agatha raised a single brow. "Suppose you should, The phrasing alone suggested either a lack of conviction or someone coached in the art of partial truth. "Go on," she said, notebook half open on the table, pen poised like a trap. "I do enjoy hearing people squirm." The confession came out haltingly, with pauses, stumbles, and oddly misplaced details. Names were dropped, events reordered, and the tone was far too theatrical for someone recounting a genuinely accidental death. Agatha's lips twitched in restrained amusement. Hodge twitched his tail in approval. Boswell sniffed the air as if smelling dishonesty itself. She listened carefully, eyes narrowed. Timing was off. Phrases contradicted known facts. The confession implied presence in a room she knew to be impossible. Yet every statement contained enough truth to distract from the inconsistencies. Agatha leaned back, resting a cheek on her hand. Ah, she thought, a confession crafted to mislead, but not to clear. Clever, very clever indeed. She allowed herself a small smirk, savoring the intellectual satisfaction of spotting deception that others might swallow whole. "Interesting," she said aloud. "And who advised you to phrase it like that? Surely you didn't decide to confuse me on your own." The visitor's eyes widened. A bead of sweat traced down the temple. I suppose I was trying to protect someone. It's complicated." Agatha's pen hovered. Humor tinged her irritation. Protect someone? Of course. Classic village motive. Fear, loyalty, or misplaced affection. She noted the phrase mentally. Always about someone else, never about themselves. Details in the confession didn't match the physical evidence. The overturned chair, the position of the teacup, the faint smell of polish, the timing of footsteps. Agatha felt a thrill of smug satisfaction, the kind reserved for detectives who notice what everyone else misses. She jotted a few notes, careful not to let the visitor glimpse the depth of her understanding. She said thoughtfully. "So the sequence of events. You claim you were elsewhere, yet someone saw you, quite close to the scene." The visitor stammered, a hand lifting to touch their face. "Well, Agatha's eyes sparkled. Humor, triumph, and a touch of vindictive pleasure swirled together. She imagined Hodge nodding approvingly, and Boswell smirking in feline contempt. The confession, while partial, had revealed more than the visitor realized. She leaned forward. "So this was coached, yes? Someone wanted a shield of confusion rather than clarity?" The visitor's shoulders slumped. They said nothing, confirming her suspicions. Agatha tapped her pen against the notebook, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were snapping into place. Motive, opportunity, and now protection. She could almost hear the quiet click of understanding forming in her brain. Her pulse quickened. The real motive, the spark that had set the fatal sequence in motion, was no longer hidden behind half-truths or deflections. She straightened in her chair, exhaling softly. "Yes," she whispered to herself, a sly grin tugging at her lips. "Now we're getting somewhere. Now, finally, everything makes sense." And with that, the last fog of confusion lifted slightly, leaving a sharp, thrilling clarity, one that would soon point her to the person who had acted in a moment of uncontrolled impulse.
Agatha Raisin stepped cautiously up the drive of Plover Hall, the mist curling around the hedgerows like fingers trying to pry secrets from the earth. The hall loomed ahead, freshly polished, its pale stone walls gleaming faintly in the late afternoon light. She pulled her coat tighter, boots crunching on gravel, and exhaled slowly. There was something about returning alone to a place that had already hosted a death that sharpened her senses beyond normal. Inside, the familiar smell of polish and aged wood greeted her. She inhaled deliberately, the faint tang of disinfectant mixed with something softer, almost floral, lingering from earlier bouquets. Hodge and Boswell were absent, but she imagined their critical green eyes judging her cautious movements. Agatha moved carefully through the entrance hall, hands brushing against the smooth railing. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, each tap a reminder that she was utterly alone. The chairs from the previous meeting sat neatly arranged, yet her trained eyes caught a subtle anomaly. A small side table, which she had checked before, seemed slightly off-kilter. She crouched to examine it. The faint scuff marks along the base suggested it had been moved recently, though she was certain it had been undisturbed during the chaos of discovery. Her pulse quickened. Movement implied intent, a detail overlooked when others were distracted by the body, the shock, and the police. "Interesting," she murmured, brushing a finger along the polished wood. The placement, the subtle shift, suggested someone had returned after the initial commotion, altering the scene slightly. Her mind catalogued possibilities. Why move it? Who dared risk discovery? Agatha's gaze swept the hall, noting dust patterns, footprints, and the subtle shift of light through the high windows. Each sensory detail sharpened the picture, the way sunlight reflected off the brass handles, the faint squeak from the stairwell, the echo of distant traffic from the village beyond. Everything was amplified in the stillness. She stepped lightly to the stair landing, pausing to glance down the corridor. Her instincts prickled. Something was amiss, yet subtle, almost imperceptible. She crouched briefly, eyeing the polished floor. There, a faint smudge near the door to the side room. Not mud, not dust, but something darker, like ink or polish, transferred from a hurried hand. Agatha straightened, heart quickening. That mark confirmed what she had long suspected. Someone had tampered with the scene after everyone assumed it was frozen in time. The implications cascaded through her mind, each thread leading to the possibility of a new clue. Her attention snapped upward. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they echoed faintly behind her, mismatched against the quiet hum of the building. She froze, listening. The echo came again, closer now. Whoever it was had not announced themselves, but their presence was undeniable. Agatha's pulse raced. She clutched her notebook to her chest and pressed her back lightly against the wall. Someone else is here. Her mind raced, calculating options. Should she call out? Wait? Confront? Each decision carried risk. The faint, deliberate steps approached the main hall. Agatha straightened slowly, every sense alert. Whoever had returned had their own motives, their own secrets, and her discovery of the moved object meant she might be witnessing the next layer of the puzzle. She inhaled, letting the scent of polish, wood, and faint floral arrangements ground her. Calm, she told herself, despite the rising tension. And then the echoing steps stopped. Agatha's fingers tightened around the notebook. The next moment, everything could change.
Chapter 7. The Fatal Meeting Explained. Agatha Raisin adjusted her scarf with a flourish, settling herself at the front of Plover Hall like a conductor preparing an orchestra. The hall, polished and gleaming from recent renovations, felt unnervingly silent compared to the hum of gossip and curiosity that usually filled Carsley's social spaces. Today, every villager was present, including those she suspected most, some openly, others through careful observation of their eyes, fingers, and posture. "Thank you for returning," Agatha began, voice calm yet carrying a subtle authority. "I realize the events of last week left more questions than answers, and I think it's time we clarify matters." She gestured toward the side room, the scene of the body discovery. Polite coughs, a few shifting chairs, and the low murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Agatha's eyes swept each face, catching tiny tells, the tightening of a jaw, the flick of a wrist, the faint tremor in a hand gripping a teacup. She smiled faintly. Timing and attention, she thought, always revealed more than forced words. "Let us start with the meeting itself. Who was present? Who left when, and, most importantly, what was attempted in secrecy?" Her pen hovered over her notebook. The villagers leaned in slightly, as if drawn forward by the unspoken tension. She began to recount the events, the arrival of the missing document, the forged signature, the sudden thud upstairs, and the empty chair that had caused silent unease. Her delivery was measured, sprinkling in dry humor. It seems someone believed that carefully crafting a narrative, complete with rehearsed alibis, would be sufficient to convince us all. How charmingly optimistic. A ripple of nervous laughter passed among the crowd. Agatha allowed it, letting humor disarm before striking with precision. Yet, even the most meticulous deception leaves traces.
A misaligned chair, ink-stained fingers, inconsistent statements. She let her gaze linger meaningfully. Each piece fits neatly together, though some may not realize it. Eyes darted, fingers twitched, a few villagers cleared throats. One hand rose subtly, attempting to deny, yet the tension betrayed unease. Agatha continued, highlighting inconsistencies, exposing attempts to shield others, and carefully guiding everyone toward the truth without outright accusation, until finally she paused, letting the suspense steep like a strong tea. "And so," she said, leaning slightly forward, "all evidence points to a single conclusion. The confrontation was not planned, yet when it occurred, it triggered a series of decisions, some regrettable, some fatal. One individual tried to control the outcome and failed." She scanned the room, noting reactions. Some faces reddened, others paled. One pair of eyes flickered in panic. She smirked internally. Hodge and Boswell would have been proud. The mixture of humor, justice, and irony was deeply satisfying. Just as Agatha began to summarize the final connection, the proof linking the forged document to the timing of events, there was a sudden interruption. The double doors to the hall burst open. Every eye snapped toward the entrance. The killer, who had been silently observing, stepped forward, face pale but resolute, scanning the assembled crowd. Gasps rippled across the hall. Teacups rattled on saucers. Agatha's pulse quickened, though her voice remained steady. "Ah," she murmured, the dry humor in her tone barely masking the thrill of the moment. The killer's lips parted, either to deny, justify, or perhaps attempt a last escape. Every breath, every movement now counted. Agatha's sharp gaze flicked from the intruder to the witnesses, noting reactions, triangulating truths hidden in panic and deception. It was a delicate balance. Humor, timing, observation, and courage all converged. Every villager, every clue, every subtle slip had led to this precise moment. And with the killer in the room, the truth, the final proof, was ready to be revealed. The hall held its collective breath. Agatha smiled faintly. Today, Plover Hall would finally surrender its secrets.
The killer stood rigid, eyes darting nervously from Agatha Raisin to the witnesses surrounding them. The hall seemed to shrink, the polished floors reflecting every twitch of a hand, every hesitation magnifying tension. Agatha's gaze, sharp and patient, fixed firmly on the suspect, as if daring them to falter. Finally, a quivering voice broke the silence. I suppose it's time," the killer stammered. I can't pretend anymore." The hall, once humming with curiosity and polite anxiety, fell utterly still. Even the faint clink of a teacup seemed magnified. Agatha's lips curled into a faintly ironic smile. Timing, she thought, was everything. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," the confession continued. "It was supposed to be a confrontation, just words, a bit of persuasion, but it went wrong." Gasps rippled through the villagers, fingers twitched and eyes widened as the truth began to crystallize. Agatha's sharp mind parsed every detail, every hesitation, every small inflection in the voice. Jealousy, fear of exposure, and a desperate attempt to maintain status, each thread wove together a motive strong enough to spark tragedy. "It started with envy," the killer admitted, voice low but trembling. They were going to change things at Plover Hall, upset everything, and I couldn't let that happen. I didn't think it would get out of hand." Agatha nodded slightly, absorbing the subtle confession. Hodge, invisible but imagined, would have approved of the deduction, and Boswell would have rolled his eyes at the predictability of human folly. She observed the body of details she had collected, the forged document, the misplaced chair, the faint traces of polish, and the witness discrepancies. Everything now fell into a single inevitable pattern. The killer's hands fidgeted, ink stains faintly visible on their fingers, a signature mark of the hurried forgery Agatha had identified days earlier. Each small detail confirmed the narrative. "I thought," the killer continued, voice cracking, "that no one would find out. I only wanted to protect myself, my position, my reputation. I never meant—" Agatha stepped slightly closer, gently cutting off any further dramatics. "Yes," she said softly but firmly, "we've followed the evidence, understood the slip-ups, and identified the sequence. Your actions, though unintended in outcome, had very real consequences, and you attempted to manipulate perception to cover it." The killer's shoulders slumped, as though the weight of both guilt and exposure had become unbearable. Their eyes flickered briefly to the side room, then to the assembled villagers. "I didn't plan the death," they admitted, "but I couldn't admit my fear. I tried to control what was happening, and it escalated." The silence that followed was heavy, dense. Agatha noted the subtle tremor of voices elsewhere, the collective pause of the hall, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The villagers' expressions ranged from shock to relief, yet all shared a single unspoken thought: it could have been prevented. Agatha's own mind raced, connecting the final dots. The death had been accidental, a misjudged confrontation fueled by envy and desperation. Yet the layers of deceit, the forged documents, the carefully constructed alibis, all of it had created a tension that nearly doubled the cost of a single tragic moment. Hodge and Boswell might have disapproved of human drama, but Agatha allowed herself a quiet inward grin at having pieced it together. The killer finally lowered their gaze, voice quiet now. "I suppose now you understand everything." Agatha nodded once, deliberately measured. "Yes," she murmured, "now we understand. And now everyone else does too." Silence fell. It wasn't the quiet of relief, nor the quiet of the mundane. It was the heavy, lingering hush that follows revelation, the pause between knowledge and acceptance, where everyone in Plover Hall felt the weight of truth settle into the room. And in that silence, Agatha Raisin realized that while the mystery had been unraveled, the echoes of human folly and village rivalry would linger far longer than the polished floors or the gentle spring sunlight.
Chapter 8. Restoration and Tea. Agatha Raisin pushed open the door of her Carsley cottage and let the familiar warmth envelop her. The smell of roasted bread and faintly burnt toast from the morning still lingered, but today it felt comforting, not tragic. Hodge and Boswell sat perched on the counter, tails flicking impatiently, green eyes glinting in judgment. They had observed her exploits from afar, or at least she imagined they had, and now seemed eager to assess the results of her investigation. "All right, you two," she said, dropping her coat on the nearest chair. "The game's over. Plover Hall's secrets are laid bare. The killer confessed, and justice— well, justice in Carsley is relative, but let's call it justice." Hodge emitted a single approving meow. Boswell, in contrast, merely blinked, unimpressed. Agatha rolled her eyes. She could almost hear their internal monologues. Did you really need to risk your neck over paperwork and gossip? And wine, of course, was involved. She opened the pantry and set about the comforting rituals of home, filling bowls with fresh kibble, arranging a small plate of biscuits she had baked earlier, and brewing a strong pot of tea. The kitchen filled with the comforting clatter of china and the hiss of boiling water. She paused to watch the sunlight catch dust motes in the warm air, feeling the weight of tension lift ever so slightly. As she settled at the table, Hodge winding around her ankles and Boswell perched on the windowsill, she allowed herself a rare moment of self-satisfaction. The village's tangled web of deceit, envy, and mishap had been unraveled, largely thanks to her keen eye, persistent curiosity, and, of course, impeccable timing. She poured tea, the scent of bergamot filling the room. With a triumphant flourish, she placed the correct biscuits next to her cup, ones that weren't burnt or crumbly, finally satisfying her exacting standards. A small, satisfied smile curved her lips. Her thoughts drifted to Carsley itself. The village would now breathe a little easier, free from the tension that had clung to Plover Hall. Gossip would simmer down, grudges would continue, but the immediate threat had passed. And yet, she suspected, change was inevitable. People would look at each other differently now, and some would be more cautious, even deferential, around her. Agatha relished the subtle power, though she would never admit it aloud. Hodge purred loudly, weaving between her feet, and Boswell gave a slow blink, his feline approval unmistakable. Agatha chuckled, scratching behind Hodge's ears. Yes, yes, you two. I know. I deserve a little recognition, too. You can be smug later. She sipped her tea, savoring the warmth, and let her gaze drift to the garden outside. Daffodils swayed gently in the breeze, a quiet reminder that life, however chaotic, moved on. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a breath free of tension or calculation. The village might have its rivalries, its petty disputes, and its secrets, but here in her kitchen, she could savor victory, comfort, and routine. Her victory, however, was only lightly savored before the sound of the mailbox rattling made her ears prick up. A small envelope slid through the slot, landing neatly on the mat. Agatha arched her brow, a flicker of curiosity and suspicion dancing in her eyes. Just when I thought I could relax, she thought wryly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Setting down her tea, she carefully slit the envelope open, peering inside. And there it was, the first whisper of a new mystery, neatly folded, waiting for her attention.
The sun slanted softly across Carsley Village the following morning, glinting on dew-specked rooftops and painting the cobbles in gentle gold. The air smelled faintly of freshly baked bread, damp earth, and the promise of spring. Agatha Raisin wandered past her garden gate, Hodge padding silently at her heels, while Boswell chose the sunny windowsill, surveying the world with detached superiority. The village seemed to breathe easier, lighter, as if the events at Plover Hall had finally released a long-held tension. Agatha allowed herself a slow smile. Peace had returned, albeit temporarily, to Carsley. Shopkeepers greeted each other with their usual muted politeness, and gossiping neighbors exchanged cautious glances that contained no hidden fear, at least not today. Even Penelope Firth Jones had retreated to recalibrate her influence, no longer dominating conversations or hovering over village decisions. The reorganization at Plover Hall had been swift. A new committee now presided, less cunning, less vindictive, and decidedly less smug. Walking past the hall, Agatha observed the subtle signs of change. Fresh flowers in the entrance, a freshly polished nameplate on the door, and a gentle flurry of village children practicing in the hall's gardens. The side room where the tragic event had occurred had been redecorated, its dark echoes replaced with light paint and soft rugs. A sense of closure settled over the scene, though she knew the village's equilibrium was as delicate as spun sugar. Hodge twined around her ankles impatiently, and she bent to scratch behind her ears. Yes, yes, the village is safe for now. You'll have to forgive my indulgence, but one must enjoy victory while it lasts. Boswell blinked slowly from his perch, green eyes gleaming with feline approval, though he might have objected to her self-congratulation if he spoke human. Inside her cozy kitchen, Agatha poured herself a cup of tea, the warm steam carrying the comforting scent of bergamot. She placed a plate of biscuits next to her cup, the right ones this time, crisp and golden, perfectly baked. Settling at the table, she allowed herself the pleasure of reviewing the past week in her mind. She had unraveled lies, identified deception, and exposed the truth. The village would remember, quietly or not, that Agatha Raisin had noticed details others ignored. Her gaze drifted to the window. The daffodils in the garden swayed gently, and a soft breeze brought the scent of flowering trees. Life had resumed its gentle rhythm, villagers tending gardens, children laughing in the square, the occasional bark of a dog echoing down the lane. Carsley felt restored, serene, and yet not entirely predictable. Agatha's mind wandered to the possibilities ahead, a familiar thrill stirring. Peace in a village like Carsley was always temporary. There would be new tensions, petty rivalries, and undiscovered secrets. She sipped her tea, allowing herself a satisfied smirk. Hodge meowed as if in agreement, and Boswell's eyes glimmered knowingly. Even the cats seemed to acknowledge that her respite might be brief. A faint knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She set down her cup and glanced toward the hallway. Hodge's tail twitched with anticipation,
Boswell stretched lazily, yet his gaze followed every shadow. Agatha rose carefully, curiosity tinged with the faintest hint of apprehension. Whatever awaited her beyond the door, she knew Carsley would never remain as tranquil for long. New mysteries, conflicts, and opportunities for observation, and perhaps a little revenge, would inevitably follow. Agatha opened the door slowly. Outside, a small envelope rested on the mat, its handwriting unfamiliar, elegant, and deliberate. She picked it up, examining it with a spark of interest. Another adventure, another puzzle was calling. With a quiet sigh of satisfaction and anticipation, Agatha Raisin returned to her kitchen, Hodge brushing against her legs, Boswell observing silently, as the village beyond resumed its gentle rhythm, blissfully unaware that peace, as always, would be fleeting. Carsley was resettled, for now. Thank you for joining Agatha on this delightful misadventure. If you enjoyed the story, do let us know in the comments, and perhaps share it with a friend who loves a good murder with a cup of tea. Until next time, stay